I didn't realize my wife had built 3 separate lives until one man thanked me for supporting her dream. My name is Ryan Mitchell, I'm 39, and up until 6 weeks ago, I thought my marriage was boring in the safest possible way, the kind of quiet stability you don't question because nothing seems broken on the surface. Olivia ran what she called a consulting business out of a rented office space downtown, said her clients were private, high-end, the kind that valued discretion. And I believed her because it fit the image she projected, organized, ambitious, always a step ahead. Our life in Denver was simple, a 2-story house, a predictable routine, my job in logistics, her business, growing year after year without ever becoming something I could clearly define. But that's how it starts, not with a loud crash, but with a detail that doesn't quite fit, like a sentence missing a word. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I got the email, subject line blank, just a forwarded invoice attached. I almost deleted it. Assumed it was spam, until I saw her name in the body, not Olivia Mitchell. But Liv. Casual, familiar, the message read like a thank you note, short, confident. Tell your husband I appreciate him backing you like this. Most guys wouldn't understand. I read it twice, then a third time. My coffee went cold in my hand, because I didn't understand, not the tone, not the assumption, not the version of my wife this man thought he knew. I didn't call her. I didn't text. I didn't react. I sat there at my desk, watching the clock tick like it had somewhere more important to be, and for the first time in years, I felt something shift, not anger, not yet, something colder, quieter, the kind of realization that doesn't shout, it settles. That night, Olivia came home late, same as always, heels in one hand, phone in the other. She smiled, kissed my cheek, asked about my day like she hadn't just stepped out of a life I wasn't part of. I watched her move through the kitchen, effortless, controlled. Every gesture exactly the woman I thought I married, and I realized something else. I didn't actually know where she had been, not really. I knew the story, the version she told, but not the truth behind it, and once that thought takes hold, it doesn't let go. I told myself it was nothing, a misunderstanding, a client being overly familiar, but the email stayed in my mind, looping, precise, wrong in a way I couldn't ignore, so I did the only thing that made sense in that moment. I opened my laptop, typed in the name of her business, and hit search, expecting to find a website. A listing. Something solid, something real, but what came back was silence. No reviews, no registration, no digital footprint that matched the success she talked about, just a polished logo on a single page that looked like it had never been updated. And that's when the quiet turned into something else, not panic, not yet, but awareness, the kind that tells you the story you've been living might not be the only one unfolding, and somewhere inside that gap, between what I believed and what I could prove, I understood one thing clearly: if her business wasn't real, then neither was the life she said she was building, and if that wasn't real, then who exactly had I been married to all this time? I did not sleep that night, not because I was angry, but because my mind would not stop trying to fix something that no longer made sense. I lay there staring at the ceiling while Olivia breathed evenly beside me, like nothing in the world had shifted. Like there was not a version of her life unfolding that I had never been invited into, and sometime around 3 in the morning I stopped trying to explain it away and started asking a different question, not what is going on, but how long has this been happening? The next morning I kept everything the same coffee, same routine, same casual tone. When I asked her what she had planned for the day, she did not hesitate, said she had client meetings, back to back, downtown. She even mentioned the office, Suite 214. The same place she had referenced for years, and that detail mattered because now I had something concrete, something I could check without asking another question. I nodded, told her I had a full schedule too, and watched her leave like I had watched her leave 100 times before, except this time I did not go to work. I waited 10 minutes, grabbed my keys, and drove in the opposite direction. Downtown traffic was slow, the kind of steady crawl that gives you too much time to think, but I did not let my mind spiral. I focused on details, the address, the building, the stories she had told me so many times it felt real. When I pulled up, the building looked right, modern glass, clean signage. The kind of place a small consulting firm could exist without drawing attention. I parked across the street, sat in my car, and watched. People went in and out. Professionals, briefcases, coffee cups, normal. Nothing that screamed deception, but normal can hide a lot if you are not looking closely. After 20 minutes I got out, walked inside, kept my expression neutral, like I belonged there. The lobby was quiet. A receptionist sat behind a desk scrolling through something on her screen. I walked up, gave her a polite smile, and said I was there to see Olivia Mitchell in suite 214. She paused, just for a second, the kind of pause that most people would ignore. Then she frowned slightly and said there was no suite 214 in the building. Not now, not ever. I felt that same cold shift from the night before settle deeper, but I did not react. I asked if maybe it had changed numbers, if perhaps it was listed under a business name instead. She shook her head, pulled up a directory, turned the screen toward me. Every office listed, every company accounted for, and Olivia was not there. Her business was not there, nothing even close. I thanked her, walked out, and did not stop moving until I was back in my car with the door closed and the noise of the street muted to a distant hum. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, not out of panic, but because I needed something solid to hold on to while everything else shifted. The office did not exist, the address was a story. And if the place she claimed to spend most of her time was not real, then every late night, every missed dinner, every explanation built on that location collapsed with it. I pulled out my phone, opened the email again, reread the message, and this time I noticed something I had missed before. A name at the bottom, not a company signature, just a first name. Mark. Casual, confident, like he did not expect to be questioned. I typed it into my search bar along with the city. Nothing at first, then a few profiles. One stood out, a man in his early 40s, local, connected to small business investments, the kind of person who would have reason to talk about backing someone's dream. I stared at his photo longer than I should have, not because I recognized him, but because something about the situation was starting to take shape, not clearly, not completely, but enough to understand this was not random, this was structured, deliberate, and whatever Olivia was doing, it involved people who believed in a version of her that I had never seen. I leaned back in my seat, exhaled slowly, and made a decision right there in that parking lot. I was not going to confront her, not yet. Because whatever truth existed behind all of this, it was bigger than one conversation, and if I wanted to understand it, I needed to stop being her husband for a moment, and start being someone else entirely, someone who could see what she thought she had hidden. I spent the rest of that afternoon building a version of myself she would not recognize, not physically, but in the way I moved through information, the way I stopped assuming and started verifying. Because once you accept that someone has been lying to you with consistency, you realize the truth is not going to come in one clean piece, it comes in fragments, and you have to decide whether you are willing to put them together. I started with the simplest angle, the name from the email, Mark. I dug deeper, not obsessively, just methodically, public records, business profiles, social platforms, the kind of surface-level search most people never think twice about, and within an hour I had a clearer picture. Mark Reynolds, investor, mid-sized portfolio. Nothing flashy but enough capital to matter, the kind of man who funds ideas more than he builds them. And then I saw it, a photo from a networking event posted 3 months ago, a group shot, half a dozen people smiling under a banner I did not recognize, and there she was, Olivia, standing just close enough to him to suggest familiarity, not distance, not professional spacing, something else, something practiced. I zoomed in, studied her expression, the way her hand rested lightly near his arm, not touching, but close enough to imply connection, and that was the moment the story shifted again, because this was not random, this was a role she was playing. And she had played it well enough to be photographed without hesitation. I leaned back in my chair and let that sink in. One man, one version of her life, but the email had not felt exclusive, it felt casual, like he was not the only one who knew her that way. So I kept going, not faster, just deeper. I traced the event, the organization behind it, cross-referenced attendees, and another name surfaced, Daniel Brooks, different industry, real estate, older, more established, and when I searched him I found something that tightened everything into place. A post from 6 weeks ago, a private dinner, tagged. Location, upscale restaurant downtown. And Olivia again, different dress, different posture, different smile, this time seated across from him, closer, more intimate in a way that did not need explanation but still avoided anything obvious, just enough to suggest a relationship that could be interpreted in more than one way. I stared at that image longer than I should have, not because it shocked me, but because it confirmed something I had been trying not to say out loud. This was not a single mistake, not a one-time lapse. This was structured, layered, intentional. 2 men, 2 different versions of her, and neither of them matched the woman who kissed me goodbye that morning. I closed the browser for a moment, rubbed my eyes, and thought about going home, about sitting across from her at dinner and pretending none of this existed. But that option was gone now, replaced by something else. A need for clarity that would not let me step back, so I opened my laptop again and went further. I searched her business name the way a stranger would, not as a husband trying to confirm a story, but as a potential client, and that is when I found it, a contact form, simple, minimal, asking for a name, email, an inquiry, no address, no phone number, just a digital doorway into something that did not exist physically. I hesitated for a second, not because I was unsure, but because I understood what this meant. Once I stepped through that door, I was no longer observing, I was participating. I was entering whatever system she had built, and that meant I might see things I could not ignore. I typed a name that was not mine, created an email address that could not be traced back to me, and wrote a message, short, direct, the kind of inquiry a new client might send, asking about consulting services, availability, and pricing. Nothing personal, nothing revealing, just enough to get a response. I hovered over the send button for a moment, then clicked it, and as the message disappeared from the screen, I felt that same quiet certainty settle in again, because whatever Olivia had created, whatever version of herself she had been selling to other people, I had just stepped into it. And sooner or later, she was going to respond, not as my wife, but as someone else entirely. I expected a response within a day, maybe 2, something polite and distant, the way most businesses handle cold inquiries. But what I did not expect was how fast it came. Less than 3 hours later my phone buzzed with a new email notification, and for a second I just stared at the screen without opening it. Because I already knew who it was from, not Olivia, not my wife, but whatever version of her existed behind that contact form. I opened it slowly, reading every word like it mattered more than it should. "Thank you for reaching out. I would be happy to discuss your needs and see how we can align your goals with the right strategy." The tone was clean, professional, almost too polished, but it was the name at the bottom that made my chest tighten. Not Olivia Mitchell, not anything close. It was signed Olivia Carter, and I read it again just to be sure I had not misunderstood. Different last name, same voice, same rhythm in the way she structured her sentences, like she had simply stepped into another identity without hesitation. I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath. Because now I was not just dealing with secrets, I was dealing with roles. She was not hiding one life, she was managing multiple versions of herself, each one tailored to whoever was on the other side. I replied carefully, keeping my tone neutral, asking about availability, suggesting a meeting, and within minutes she responded again, this time offering a consultation, Thursday afternoon. A location not listed on any website, just an address typed plainly in the email, a coffee shop across town, public, controlled, safe, the kind of place you meet someone when you want flexibility, not permanence. I memorized the address before closing the message, and for the rest of that day I moved through everything like nothing had changed. I went home, sat across from Olivia at dinner, listened to her talk about her clients, about how busy things had been, how she might need to travel next week, and I watched her closely, not for lies, but for consistency, the way her stories lined up with what I was now seeing from the outside. And what stood out was not what she said, but how easily she said it. No hesitation, no cracks, just a smooth continuation of the same narrative she had always given me. And that told me something important. She had been doing this long enough that the lines were not blurred for her, they were defined, separated, controlled. Later that night, after she went to bed, I sat in the living room with the lights off and the glow of my laptop reflecting off the screen, and I'd pulled up everything again: Mark Reynolds, Daniel Brooks, now Olivia Carter, 3 separate threads that did not intersect on the surface. But I knew they connected somewhere beneath it, and the more I looked, the clearer the pattern became. Each man existed in a different part of the city, different industries, different social circles, no overlap, no reason to cross paths. It was deliberate. Structured in a way that minimized risk, like she had built a system designed to keep each version of her life isolated, and that realization settled into something heavier than suspicion, because this was not chaos, this was design. I checked the time, just past midnight, and thought about Thursday, about sitting across from her as someone else, hearing her speak without the filter of marriage, seeing how she presented herself when she did not think I was watching, and for the first time since this started, I felt something close to control, not because I understood everything, but because I finally had a way in, a direct line into the world she thought was hidden. And as I closed my laptop and sat there in the quiet, one thought stayed with me: she believed she was managing separate lives, but she had made one mistake. She assumed those lives would never collide, and in less than 48 hours, I was going to make sure they did. Thursday came slower than it should have, not because time changed, but because I was measuring it differently. Every hour felt like a step closer to something I could not undo, and by the time I parked 2 blocks away from the coffee shop she had chosen, I was not thinking like a husband anymore. I was thinking like someone about to test a system. I arrived early, not to wait for her, but to observe the environment. The place was exactly what I expected: neutral, modern, just enough noise to keep conversations private, people working on laptops, a few quiet meetings in the corner, nothing that would stand out. I chose a table near the back with a clear view of the entrance, sat down, ordered black coffee, and kept my posture relaxed. My phone in front of me with the fake email account open, just in case she tried to confirm anything. At exactly 2:17 in the afternoon, she walked in, not Olivia Mitchell, not the woman who left our house that morning, but Olivia Carter, and the difference was not in her appearance, it was in the way she carried herself: sharper, more deliberate, like she had stepped into a role she understood perfectly. She scanned the room once, spotted me, and smiled, not the familiar smile I knew, but something more measured, more calculated. She walked over, extended her hand, introduced herself without hesitation. "Hi, I am Olivia." No last name this time, just enough identity to function, not enough to be traced. I stood, shook her hand, matched her tone, gave the name I had created, and for a moment, we stood there like two strangers who had never shared a life. Then we sat down and she began asking about my goals, my business, my expectations. Her questions were structured, efficient, the kind that made you feel like she was building a profile in real time, and I answered carefully, nothing too detailed, just enough to keep her engaged, while I watched, not her words, but her patterns. The way she leaned forward slightly when something interested her, the way her eyes held contact just long enough to establish trust, the way she guided the conversation without making it obvious. It was controlled, practiced, and completely detached from anything personal, and that was the part that unsettled me the most. There was no overlap between this version of her and the woman I knew at home, no hesitation, no slip, just a seamless performance. At one point she mentioned other clients, vague references, different industries, different needs, and I listened closely, because even in her generalizations there were hints, subtle differences in tone when she spoke about certain types of clients, like she was shifting between roles even in conversation. I let a pause sit between us, then asked a simple question: what makes your approach different from others? She smiled, leaned back slightly, and said something that stayed with me longer than anything else she said that afternoon. She said she believed in creating tailored experiences, not just strategies, that every client needed a version of her that fit their world, their expectations, their pace. And as she spoke those words, calmly, confidently, I realized she was not just talking about business, she was describing exactly what she had been doing, not just with me, but with everyone, building versions of herself that matched whoever was in front of her. I nodded like it made sense, like I was hearing a professional explain her method. But inside something locked into place, because now I understood the structure. This was not chaos, it was customization, and if that was true, then Mark had one version, Daniel had another, and I was sitting across from a third, and the only question left was how many more existed that I had not seen yet. The meeting lasted 40 minutes, long enough to gather everything I needed, short enough to avoid suspicion. When we stood up to leave, she thanked me for my time, said she would follow up with a proposal, and walked out without looking back, and I stayed there for a moment, staring at the empty chair across from me, because for the first time since this started, I was not confused anymore. I was certain. She was not hiding one secret, she was managing multiple realities, and I had just stepped into one of them after the meeting. I did not go straight home, not because I was avoiding Olivia, but because I needed distance to think clearly. I drove without a destination for almost 20 minutes, letting the silence settle, replaying every detail from the conversation in my head, not the words themselves, but the structure behind them, the way she adapted, the way she controlled the flow, and most importantly, the way she never once slipped, not a single hesitation, not a single overlap between who she was at that table and who she was at home, and that told me something critical. This was not a recent development, this was a system she had refined over time. I pulled into an empty parking lot near a grocery store and sat there with the engine off, my phone in my hand, staring at the names I had collected so far: Mark Reynolds, Daniel Brooks. And now the version of Olivia that existed under a different name, 3 threads, 3 separate realities, and for the first time, I stopped looking at them individually and started looking at the pattern as a whole. Each man believed in a different version of her, each one existed in a separate circle, and each one had a role to play in whatever she had built. Mark with money, Daniel with status, and me, the one at home, the foundation, the stability that allowed everything else to function without question. I exhaled slowly. Because once that structure became clear, the next step was obvious. If she was maintaining separation, then the only way to break it was to bring those worlds together, not suddenly, not recklessly, but carefully, controlled, the same way she had built them in the first place. I went home that evening and everything looked exactly the same. Olivia was in the kitchen, cooking, music playing softly in the background. She turned, smiled, asked how my day was, and I answered like I always did, calm, steady, no change in tone, because at this point, the most important thing was that she did not suspect anything. She talked about her meetings, mentioned a potential new client, and I realized she was talking about me, about the version of me she believed she had just met, and the way she described it was precise, selective, giving just enough detail to sound real without revealing anything that could connect back to our life. And I nodded, listened, played my role perfectly, because now I understood that this was not about catching her in a lie. It was about understanding the full scope of what she had created. Later that night, when she went upstairs, I stayed in the living room and opened my laptop again, this time not to search, but to build. I created a second identity, different from the first, different industry, different background, something that would appeal to a different type of client, and I sent another inquiry through a separate channel I had found linked to her network. The message was slightly different, more direct, more aligned with investment interests, and I waited, not long, just enough to see if the pattern held, and it did. Within a few hours, another response came in, different tone, different structure, and this time signed with another variation of her name, subtle, but distinct enough to confirm what I already suspected. She was not just managing 3 lives, she was capable of creating as many as she needed, and that realization shifted everything again, because now the number was not fixed, it was expandable, limited only by how much she could control. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, and for the first time, I felt something close to clarity, not emotional, not reactive, but strategic. Because if she was building a system based on separation, then the most effective way to expose it was not through confrontation, but through convergence, bringing the right people into the same space. At the same time, letting the truth reveal itself without me having to say a word, and as that idea settled in, fully formed, I understood that this was no longer about discovering what she had done, it was about deciding how it would end once the plan formed. Everything else became execution, not emotional, not reactive, just steps that needed to be placed in the right order. I spent the next 2 days mapping out how her worlds operated, not guessing, not assuming, but confirming patterns. Through the responses I continued to receive, each identity she used had its own tone, its own pacing, even its own availability windows, like she had segmented her time to avoid overlap, mornings for one type of client, afternoons for another, evenings reserved for what I now understood was her primary life with me, and the more I watched, the clearer it became that she believed this structure was unbreakable. That as long as each version of her remained contained, there would never be a point of collision, so I decided to create one, not by forcing it, but by offering her an opportunity she would not question. I replied to her through the first identity, the one she met at the coffee shop, and expressed interest in moving forward, asked about a larger engagement, something that would require a formal introduction, a presentation, a setting where she would need to bring her business into a more visible space. She responded quickly, intrigued, professional, asking for details, and I gave her just enough, a potential partnership, multiple stakeholders, a chance to expand what she had built, nothing too specific, just enough to trigger ambition. At the same time, through the second identity, I approached from a different angle, investment, interest in funding, but with the condition that there be a meeting with all parties involved, a discussion that required transparency, and again, she agreed. Not immediately, but after a few exchanges that showed she was calculating the opportunity, weighing risk against reward, and what she saw was growth, not exposure. I could tell by the way her responses shifted, slightly more engaged, slightly more eager, still controlled, but leaning forward, and that was exactly what I needed. By the end of the second day, she had proposed a solution herself, a small event, a private gathering where she could present her business to interested parties, keep it contained, manage the narrative, control the room, and I accepted without hesitation, because that was the moment everything aligned. She had just invited her own worlds into the same space, without realizing it. The event was set for Saturday evening at a rented venue, not large, not public, just enough space to host a handful of people, curated, controlled, exactly how she liked it, and I spent the next day preparing the final piece. I reached out to Mark Reynolds directly, not as myself, but as a mutual connection, referencing Olivia's work, suggesting he attend, positioning it as an opportunity he would not want to miss. His response came within hours, interested, confirming availability. Then I did the same with Daniel Brooks, a slightly different approach, more formal, more aligned with his status, and again, he agreed, and just like that, the structure she had built over months, maybe years, began to shift, not visibly, not yet, but internally, because for the first time the lines between her separate realities were no longer parallel, they were converging. I sat in my living room Friday night, Olivia upstairs packing for what she said was a long meeting the next day, and I listened to her move through the house, calm, confident, completely unaware of what was coming, and I realized something in that moment. She had spent so much time perfecting the illusion, she never considered what would happen if someone chose not to believe it, not to confront it, but to step inside it and rearrange it from within. And as I turned off the lights and sat in the quiet, one thought stayed steady. By this time tomorrow, she would walk into a room she believed she controlled, and for the first time, every version of her life would be waiting there. Together Saturday evening arrived with a kind of stillness that did not feel accidental. The air outside the venue was cool, quiet, the kind of early night calm that hides what is about to happen. I arrived first. Not as Ryan Mitchell, not as any version she knew, but as the one identity she had agreed to meet, dressed simply, neutral, nothing that would draw attention. I stepped inside and immediately took control of the only thing that mattered now, positioning. The room was exactly as she described, modest, clean, a few standing tables, a small presentation area, just enough space to feel professional without being exposed. I spoke briefly with the staff, confirmed the arrangement, then chose a place near the back where I could see everything without being the center of it, and then I waited, not nervously, not impatiently, just present, because everything from this point forward depended on timing. The first to arrive was Mark Reynolds. He walked in with the confidence of someone used to being early, scanning the room the way investors do, evaluating, measuring. I approached him briefly. Introduced myself under the identity he expected, exchanged a few controlled words, just enough to confirm he was in the right place, and then stepped away, giving him space, letting him settle into the environment without pressure. 15 minutes later, Daniel Brooks arrived, different energy, more reserved, more calculated. He did not look around as much. He moved directly to a table, checked his watch once, then his phone, and I watched the distance between them, two men in the same room, completely unaware of each other, both believing they were here for a private opportunity, and that was the moment I knew the structure was holding. For now, I kept my distance, moving between positions, never drawing attention, just observing. Then, at exactly 7:03, Olivia walked in, and the shift in the room was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. She paused for half a second at the entrance, just enough time to register the space, the people, the arrangement, and then she stepped forward. Composed, confident, exactly the version she had prepared to be, she greeted Mark first, her tone warm, familiar, then turned slightly and saw Daniel, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw something break, not visibly to anyone else, but to me it was clear, a fraction of hesitation, a recalibration happening in real time. Her eyes moved between them, just once, calculating, adjusting, and then she smiled again, controlled, but tighter now, less fluid. She walked over to Daniel, greeted him with a tone that did not match the one she had just used, and in that small difference, the first crack appeared. The two men exchanged a glance, subtle, questioning, not enough to trigger suspicion yet, but enough to register that something was not aligned. I stayed where I was, watching it unfold exactly as I had anticipated, not stepping in, not interfering, because this was not about confrontation, it was about exposure through reality. Olivia moved through the room, trying to stabilize the situation, speaking, redirecting, maintaining the illusion, but the problem was no longer what she said, it was what could be seen, the overlap, the inconsistency. The presence of two separate narratives occupying the same space. Mark asked a simple question about the structure of the business, Daniel followed with a different question about partnerships, and Olivia answered both, but not the same way. Her responses shifted, adjusted, contradicted each other in small ways that only became obvious when heard together, and the tension in the room began to rise, not dramatically, not loudly, but steadily, like something underneath was starting to surface. I took a step forward. Not into the center, but closer, enough to be within range, enough to see her clearly now, and for the first time, her eyes met mine, not as my wife, not as someone who recognized me immediately, but as a stranger noticing another presence in the room. And then, in the space of a single second, everything aligned, recognition, confusion, realization, all passing through her expression before she could stop it, and that was the moment the illusion stopped being sustainable, not because I said anything, not because I revealed anything, but because all the pieces she had kept separate were now visible at the same time, and there was no version of her that could hold them together anymore. The silence that followed was not immediate, it built, piece by piece, as each realization settled into the room. Mark looked at Daniel, Daniel looked back at Mark, and then both of them looked at Olivia, not with anger, not at first, but with confusion, the kind that comes when two separate truths collide and neither one fits anymore. Olivia tried to recover. She stepped forward slightly, her voice steady, offering an explanation that sounded complete on its own, but incomplete in that moment. Because it did not account for the other version of her standing in the same space. She spoke about business models, about different types of partnerships, about how she tailored her approach depending on the client, and under normal circumstances, it might have worked, it might have smoothed over the inconsistencies, but not now. Not when both men were hearing the same words from two different perspectives at the same time. Mark asked her directly how long she had been working with Daniel, and she hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second, before answering, and that hesitation was enough. Daniel followed with his own question, referencing a conversation they had weeks ago, something specific, something personal to their version of her connection, and again, Olivia responded. But this time her answer did not align with what Mark had just heard, and the room shifted again, not louder, not chaotic, but heavier, like the truth was settling into place without needing to be announced, I stood there, still just outside the center, watching it unfold without stepping in, because at this point, there was nothing I needed to add. The structure was collapsing under its own weight. Olivia turned slightly, her eyes finding mine again, and this time there was no delay, no uncertainty. She recognized me fully, not as a stranger, not as a client, but as the one person she had never expected to see in that room, and in that moment, everything she had built lost its separation. Every version of her life intersected in a single point, and there was no path back to control. She took a step toward me, not aggressively, not dramatically, just enough to close the distance, and for the first time, her voice dropped the professional tone completely. She said my name quietly, like she was testing whether this was real, and I nodded once, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just acknowledgement, because this was never about creating a scene, it was about allowing the truth to exist in a space where it could not be managed. Mark and Daniel both turned toward me then, their attention shifting, not fully understanding yet, but aware that I was part of something they had not been told, and I did not explain everything. I did not need to. I simply said that I had been learning about the business the same way they had, through the versions of Olivia she chose to show, and that was enough, because it reframed the entire situation without accusation, without emotion, just clarity. Olivia stood there, silent now, the calculations that had defined her for so long no longer working, because there was no version of her that could address all of us at once without contradiction. The room stayed quiet for a few seconds that felt longer than they were, and then Mark exhaled, shook his head slightly, and stepped back, not saying much, just enough to signal he understood what this was. Daniel followed, more reserved, but equally aware, and just like that, the structure she had built began to dissolve, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with the absence of belief. One by one, the people who had held up her separate realities stepped away from them, and what remained was not a dramatic ending, not a loud collapse, but something simpler, the truth standing in the open, unfiltered, without a narrative to protect it. I looked at Olivia one last time, not as the woman I thought I knew, not as the person she had presented herself to be, but as someone who had spent so long managing illusions that she forgot what would happen if they ever touched. And then I turned, walked toward the exit, and left the room without waiting for anything else. Because the outcome had already been decided the moment those separate worlds were brought together. She did not lose a business that night, because it never existed in the way she claimed. What she lost was the ability to keep her realities apart, and once that separation was gone, there was nothing left to maintain.